Dr. Karine Tordo Rombaut.
Yes.
Did I pronounce right? I'm not sure.
Yes.
And Dr. Karine Tordo Rombaut at the Institute of Philosophy at the University of Grenoble-Alpes. And the title of her presentation is The Relevance of Interpreting Plato's Criticism of Image Making as Self-Directed. So Plato's self-criticism is always a fascinating subject. So I expect another exciting presentation. Please give a big welcome to our second speaker.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me?
Yep.
Is it all right? Yeah.
Can I see you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do
Okay.
you see me? Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm a teacher in a cross-curricular course in France, which prepares students for a competitive entrance examination common to a range of higher education institutions, such as École Normale Supérieure.
Ooh.
As a scholar, I am a member of the Institute of Philosophy in Grenoble, in the University of Grenoble, which is in the French Alps. I wrote my PhD about Plato's Republic, and it has been published in French under the title Pour une lecture interactive de Platon.
Oh. Thank you.
So, may I share my screen to show my text?
Okay.
Yeah. So.
Yes.
The ambiguity, not to say the inconsistency, of Plato's attitude towards images stems from the fact that he both criticizes image makers and himself incorporates images into his dialogues. Plato can hardly be suspected to indulge himself in doing something with which he so openly disagrees. This is the reason why it is commonly admitted that Plato's images possess distinctive features which allow them to evade Plato's criticism. The readers who postulate such distinctive features, which they endeavor to uncover, appear as Plato's supporters. The readers attempting to turn Plato's criticism against Plato himself appear as his opponents. The fact that Plato sometimes refers positively to specific images reinforces Plato's supporters' assumption that his criticism can be restricted. This, at least, is the usual approach. My intention is to challenge this approach and to demonstrate, as a consequence, the relevance of an alternate, counterintuitive yet consistent approach based on interpreting Plato's criticism as self-directed. Firstly, I will explain why Plato's so-called supporters' solution to the inconsistency proves unsatisfactory. Secondly, I will argue that the contradiction between what Plato does and what he says can be more suitably resolved with the contention that Plato's criticism of image makers is definitely aimed at the master image maker, namely Plato himself. Thirdly, I will show how Plato's so-called opponents turn out to be his truest supporters, taking on the task of revealing through uncompromising review the clear value of Plato's images. So first, the usual approach solution to the inconsistency. There are two correlated difficulties involved in assuming that the scope of Plato's criticism must be understood as restricted to some bad images, leaving other images, the good ones, out of reproach. This assumption overlooks the fact that the scope of the criticism is generally emphasized as unrestricted in the passages where it is voiced. Example, in Republic 6, where shadows, reflections, and everything of that sort are set in the inferior part of the line, which is divided as regards truths and untruths. Less critical or even laudatory assessments certainly do not evidence any restriction of some harsh criticism. It rather generates a contradiction to be faced and, if possible, resolved. The restriction implies a petitio principii. Since bad images are identified as deserving to be censured, good images are not deserving to be censured. The distinction is not only taken for granted from the outset, but it is also doomed to remain more or less conspicuously untested. This approach amounts to begging the question of the features respectively displayed by objectionable, that is to say sophistical, and unobjectionable philosophical images. Thus, each kind of image is arbitrarily, no proper criterion being yet available, characterized and discriminated. In short, all this to claim that Plato's images are good because they are Plato's. Therefore, in the usual approach, the criticism is surreptitiously mollified, as if it were not aimed at images as such. It dismisses the problem of which Plato's dialogues endeavor to raise awareness. For example, through the definition of dreaming in Republic 5, whether asleep or awake, to think that a likeness is not a likeness, but rather the thing itself that it is like. The problem lies in the possibility of confounding one thing with another, a real thing with what will eventually be, on behalf of this very mistake, but only once the mistake be exposed, designated as its image, previously named after the real thing. In fact, this problem is at the root of the so-called theory of ideas. Hence, Plato's criticism of images does not discard the risk of taking a bad image for a good image, a sophistic image for a philosophical one, and conversely, the former turning out to be a deceptive image of the latter arousing distrust owing to its resemblance to the former. The confusion lasts as long as it escapes notice, and escapes notice as long as it lasts, making it all the more difficult to clear it up. In these circumstances, any attempt to differentiate the real thing from a mere image of it might eventually result in increasing confusion between both. Indeed, this is an acute problem, more likely to be partly neglected than fully reviewed. Yet Plato's uncompromising censure of images rules out the very possibility of claiming, at least without simultaneously questioning and checking it, the slightest comment of any distinction between a real thing and anything that could be confounded with it. So, and only so, the censor actually manages to take the above-mentioned problem with all its acuteness into consideration. In order both to avoid being made worthless and to really prove efficient, the call for vigilance must brook no compromise. Now I'm going to expose the alternate solution I advance to solve the ambiguity or the contradiction between what Plato does and what he says. As a matter of fact, the presupposition that critics do not belong to the target group at which their criticism is aimed is in itself very questionable. Plato stands out for a highly self-critical assessment, generally endorsed by his main character Socrates, namely the avowal of ignorance. While basically philosophical, self-critical examination is unwanted enough to go unnoticed, even when markedly demonstrated. However, this philosophical practice only can fully account for the master image maker's criticism of image making. This practice paved the way for an alternate solution to the inconsistency of Plato's attitude towards images. Actually, at first sight, the alternate solution, although partially removing the inconsistency, seems either less effective than the usual one, or at least incomplete. It must still comply with two requirements. The first requirement is to give the reason why Plato has chosen to allow the possibility of redirecting the criticism against his own image making, rather than refraining from incorporating images into his dialogues, as, by his own admission in the Republic, every philosopher should do. The second requirement is to dismiss the incompatibility between, on one hand, the refusal included in the alternate solution to arbitrarily restrict the scope of Plato's criticism, and, on the other hand, Plato's positive appraisal of some images. The first requirement can be complied with a simple observation correlated with the above-mentioned acute problem raised by images. Plato is fully aware that, even for a philosopher, the claim to avoid image-making would be misleading, all the more since languages itself is an image. It might lead to nothing more than overlooking one's own dealings with images, which are deceptive by definition, as I've tried to show. Even if once an image is identified as such, it no longer produces the deception which this word image bespeaks. Then, rather than putting himself in such a danger, Plato falls back on focusing not only on the inferior status of images, decidedly including his own, compared to genuine knowledge, but also to the delusions that might result from their use as access to knowledge. Thus, the emphasis on the misconceptions entailed by image making is a second best solution, intended to counteract the unavoidable incorporation of images in philosophical discourse and training. The second best solution relies on the reader implementing the critical method suited to read images. In Republic 10, Plato almost explicitly warns his reader that this dialogue is likely to distort the thought of anyone who hears, unless he has the knowledge of what it is really like as a drug to counteract it. Socrates' refusal to value Homer more than the truth urges the reader not to value Plato more than the truth, an advice Aristotle followed. The clever craftsman who makes everything, including the sun or the characters of the dialogue, cannot be but Plato's alter ego. The critical method, so I try to show that the reader doesn't have the knowledge of what it is really like, but he has the second best solution, that is to say the criticism, the critical method. It is mentioned in Critias, in a passage where images and speeches are put together. Critias makes a distinction between two kinds of images of things of which we have no precise knowledge, and images about which we have both familiarity and lifelong knowledge. In case A, we do not examine these paintings too closely and find faults with them, but we are content to accept an art of suggestion and illusion for such things as vague and deceptive as this art is. In case B, we are quick to spot any defect. We prove harsh critics of the painter who does not fully reproduce every detail. Actually, as indicated by the words vague and deceptive, the critical method, consisting mainly in detecting flaws, should be implemented in both cases. It is in fact appropriate, whatever kind of image is considered. The second requirement, that is to prove that my contention is compatible with the praise of some images, is apparently impossible to comply. How can Plato both censure images as such and nevertheless praise some of them, thus fostering a distinction between praiseworthy and blameworthy images? Should not Plato's awareness of the above-mentioned acute problem definitely dissuade him from speaking positively about images? Such questions, although apparently equating with serious objection to the alternate approach I advance, eventually contribute to its clarification. In Cratylus, Socrates, while hinting at the specific sort of correctness belonging to images, still emphasizes the fact that images are deficient by definition. The hint at a specific sort of correctness belonging to images does not entail any suspension of the critical method. On the contrary, the method is all the more needed since the lack of attention paid to missing details might lead to confusion between images and real things. What sort of correctness is then belonging to images? As Socrates puts it, we must look for some other kind of correctness, different from the correctness belonging to numbers. The correctness belonging to images cannot but rely on the critical method, construed as a second best solution, namely a way to both repair the omissions and help get at the real thing, of which they are images. Anyone claiming to follow a more direct path to the real thing will run the risk of delusion precisely because of their excess of confidence in their own ability to avoid it. As a matter of fact, the second requirement, reconciling Plato's censure of images with his praise of some of them, can be perfectly complied through taking the submission for critical examination as criterion to characterize praiseworthy images and to discriminate them from blameworthy ones. Images involving a thoroughly self-directed criticism of images thus evade the criticism, still leaving its scope unrestricted. Praiseworthy images acquiring this characterization through raising awareness of their blameworthy features, which they display as images. The criterion is also the only way out of the previously analyzed petitio principii. Here, there is something quite paradoxical in assuming that critical examination converts deceptive images into lighting parts of philosophical discourse. The soundness of this assumption has to be tested. The critical method must prove able to enhance the value of images. So I'll try to describe the reader's task as fast as possible. The alternate solution cannot but entail a paradigm shift both in method and understanding. In the interactive paradigm, Plato's images are construed not as vehicles for dissemination of thoughts, but as instruments for philosophical practice. Plato's critical assessments urge the reader to take the images as the starting points of a learning interactive process whereby they will disclose their special teaching and ultimately, once the process is completed, meet the criticism. This process requires a very close and thorough review of the corresponding text. Such review only can fully account for the astounding yet undeniable fact that Plato is both the harshest critic of images and the master image maker. In the following, I will give a purposefully extremely basic exemplification of the critical method. Then I will use it to explain the general scheme resulting from implementation of this method. In my conclusion, I will research the relevance of the interactive paradigm based on interpreting Plato's criticism as self-directed. In Plato's dialogues, the use of body as simile for soul goes hand in hand with the emphasis on the difference between body and soul. This is particularly striking in the Phaedo, where Socrates, while referring to the soul's endeavor to differentiate itself from the body, uses such words as release, separation, purification, or untied from the body as from bonds, thus perpetuating the confusion between body and soul. What is the point of raising high awareness of the difference between body and soul if it does not involve waiving the use of bodily terms to speak about the soul? Plato's apparent carelessness is to be construed as deliberate, namely as a clue that the soundness of the metaphors relies upon taking heed of their impropriety. The condition for the metaphors actually referring to the soul is that they be intently denied the power to give the slightest idea of what the soul is. The reader's capacity to exercise vigilance is indeed put to real test. But that is not all. The test also helps the reader gain insight in the meaning of Socrates' phrases, which prove able to describe most appropriately the soul's genuine activity as he, the reader, in fact performs it at the very time he questions Socrates' wording. The only way for soul to avoid melding itself with the body consists in remaining wary as to the risk of mistaking the one, the body, for the other itself. This point is in keeping with a proposition generally understood as a definition of the soul. Whatever moves itself is no other thing but a soul. Thus, the images both jeopardize and yet foster the process named release, separation, or purification, of which the reader is expected to take charge. The reader critical examination even provides the very model which the image are uncompromisingly criticized for obscuring, but which they thus eventually unveil. Therefore, it would not be totally out of place to remark that Plato's images might remain deprived of philosophical meaning, while not Plato's criticism of image makers be interpreted as self-directed. I tried to finish fast. This very basic exemplification of the critical method helps set the general scheme of the interactive paradigm. It consists in a double examination of Plato's images. The first examination is critical. It uses Plato's own critical comments in order to closely review the images, bringing out their shortcomings. The second examination focuses on the outcomes of the first examination, revealing how it has altered the understanding of the reviewed images, which ultimately manage to perform that task and to give access to whatever they are supposed to convey. So Plato's images turn out to be self-referential in a twofold sense. They are self-deprecating, and they refer to the intellectual activity in which this self-deprecating context urges the reader to engage. So I skipped the example of the Republic, but which is a very elaborate exemplification of this double examination, since the reader who criticized the Republic, in fact, take on this task of the ruling philosopher. It's as if there was a hole in the Republic, and the reader is expected to take the empty place and to become the ruling philosopher. So my conclusion. My intention here was mainly to advance an alternate solution to the apparently paradoxical fact that Plato is both the harshest critic of images and the master image maker. I am persuaded that once it be granted that such philosophers, Plato, might reasonably be expected to acknowledge himself as belonging to the target group at which his criticism is aimed, the relevance of interpreting his criticism as self-directed will in fact appear obvious. Admittedly, the outcomes of the interactive paradigm resulting from such tenet are unconventional, but these outcomes are still very much in keeping with Plato insisting that philosophers strive to know themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation. I think we are a little bit behind the schedule, so let's get 2 short questions from the floor. Satomi Ogihara? Satoshi Ogihara, sorry.
Not me, but Yunhuan Li, I think you're raising a hand, right? Yunhuan Li.
Oh, okay. First, Yunhuan Li.
Thank you for your interesting paper. But I have a question. I'm not quite sure how, if I can make my question as straight as possible, but what if I can ask you, like, if Plato's use of image as self-directed and is actually helping us to achieve some philosophical purpose, doesn't that make his use of image making good, in contrast with the bad image making that he criticizes at the same time? So, I mean, so my point is that maybe the real substantial difference between your approach and the approach that you are criticizing may not be that big. How would you answer that question?
Thank you very much for your question, because it's a very important question. It helps me explain my position. There is you are very true. The fact that the images are intended to a philosophical practice, to allow a philosophical practice, makes them good. But the philosophical practice consists in a very harsh criticism of the images. So you can't make images good if you don't take them as bad. You have to be adamant as a critic, a very harsh critic. And I think that, for instance, Nicholas D. Smith, who has written a book about images, it's called Summoning Knowledge in Plato's Republic. And he says that criticism of images is necessary, but it doesn't go far enough in the criticism. And my experience of reading Plato is that you have to be adamant. You have to be like Socrates in the dialogues. You mustn't let anything out. And so if you do that, if you are very, a very harsh critic, then you can make the images good. Does it answer to your question?
Well, not perfectly, but anyway, yeah, that would be fine. Yes. Yes.
Okay, one more question. Okay, Martina.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Karine, for your paper, because it allows to think some issues about images. I would like just to challenge something, because I really agree with you about the role of reader, and I think that the philosophical tradition has not stressed enough the place that that the reader has in the Platonic dialogues. I have just one impression, and that's something, for example, I've experienced also reading uncut works about the reader in Plato's. It is that sometimes with this kind of stress on the criticism and the philosophical posture of the reader, I think we overstress the cognitive aspects of reading. And of course, in a philosophical text, cognitive functions are fundamental, but I think something that has to be done still for Platonic dialogues is to assess the emotional effects that a text and something like Plato's dialogues wanted to achieve. What do you think? Do you think that it is something that you can include in your discourse, or?
Yes, I think it's very important, since in my contention, there is no knowledge in the dialogues. You have to search for knowledge. The knowledge is not in the dialogues. Think, for example, of the criticism of writing in the Phaedrus. So the dialogues are written, so the lively thought is not in the dialogue. The reader has to make this thought active, and so the emotions are very important, because you have characters, and the behavior of the characters is part of the opinions they express. I mean that you can't separate what they say and the manner in which they say it. And sometimes there are a lot of emotions, and the emotions, I think, are made to provoke the reader, which is feeling emotions in himself. And so all this takes part in the interactive reading. I think that opinions are closely connected with emotions. And so you have to account for the emotions too. It's very important. For instance, most of Gorgias readers sometimes take part in Callicles' emotions. We are indignant at what Socrates is doing. And this is a sort of provocation to make the reader criticize what Socrates says. Is it clear? I'm not sure, but I think
Yes.
that the emotion are to be taken into account. You're right.
Yes, no, thank you. It just, I have, my position is slightly different, because I think that it's the emotional effects are part and not just a strategy to criticism. Like, I think that it is something that in itself is important, but it's really clear, and thank you. It was a pleasure to hear you.